1987. It's been a long time, and I've seen the field evolve. And today's talk is going to be a review of some work that has been done in my laboratory and the goal is designing cognitive architectures for sensory processing. This is joint work with my collaborator Andreas Kyle, a professor in psychology, and a large group of students. The ones that graduated are already in the slide, and this has been funded by the Office of Naval Research. The outline of my talk is I would like first to give you a brief overview of the field of computer vision and also what we know about cognitive sensory processing. And I will present a generative hierarchical model for object recognition in video, and then I will address some extensions to scene analysis, and then I conclude. I mean, the field of computer vision has been around for over 70 years, and we are still struggling with this question of what are good features for sensory processing. A lot of intelligent people have worked in this problem, and we still really don't know. And so, first of all, it's very important. The first stage of any processing algorithm is critical, because if you lose information at the front end, you'll never recover at the back end. And so this is something that people forget quite often. Of course, the field of computer vision uses the image space to find the best features, using SIFT, TOG, and many other techniques. And in deep learning, we are basically doing the same thing. We are using the image space to extract relevant information from the imagery. But an important question that we should ask is, does this really make sense? Because, the imagery is very complex, and what we really are interested for autonomous vision is to have models that are effectively invariant to small variations of the input space. And so the question is, are there alternatives of using this space, the input space? And of course, I think we all know we are a living proof that biology found ways of extracting invariant models from very complex systems. And this is an example of a picture in Florida, taken in Florida, and then you see there's a natural scene, very cluttered, lots of vegetation. It's near a water stream. You can see the water there. You also can see centered in the image objects, in that particular case, two types of birds. And of course, after this analysis, we have to understand the scene. So what is the scene about? And you may think, well, the birds are there because they are trying to get some fish. But it turns out that really, if you look more closely, Florida is also the place where we have alligators. And it turns out that hidden in the background, there is an alligator. And so you see this simple, very small feature in the picture changed drastically our understanding of what the scene is about. And take note, the birds know exactly that he is there because they are looking that direction. So you see that in order to be able to extract autonomously information from scenes, this is a very complex problem that cannot stop at the point of getting features or even objects from an image. So, of course, I'm not the first one saying this. It turns out that in the 19th century, Hermann von Helmholtz, stated this sentence that I think is very appropriate for what we are talking about, that the perceptual system is an inference engine whose function is to infer the probable causes of the sensory input. So you see, according to Helmholtz, the visual cortex is really a generative model. It's trying to find a generative model for the information that is coming from the world. And of course, in the last 100 years, cognitive science provided an impressive volume of knowledge of how the brain works. And I'm particularly keen of Joachim Fuster, who has published 3 books that I recommend for those of you interested that you should read those books: Cortex and the Mind, Memory in the Cortex, and Prefrontal Cortex. And he states his definition of perception is really, I read it 10 years ago, and I still resonates in my mind because I don't know how this can be done. Because it's a chicken and egg problem, if you think about it. Because he says that perception is memory updating. And so you have to have memory to perceive, but at the same time, the memory has to come from some place. So this really is a very difficult problem, but it shows the relationship between internal models and really the imagery in the feedback path. And of course, I think that our role as machine learning experts and network experts is really to translate these concepts in a mathematical way such that we can complete the computational theory of perception that was started by Mars in vision and by Bergman and others in the auditory scene analysis. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief view of what is there after the cortex, the sensory cortex. If you think about it, in a very, simplistic way, but I think that goes to the core of the problem. The knowledge in our brains comes from basically three sources: genetic code that builds the brain, interaction with the environment that trains the parameters, if you will, of the system, and of course the repository of knowledge that we have in our society, in our culture. But although we can pinpoint what are the sources of knowledge, how we get it is a different story. And we also are aware that there's many processes that are going on in autonomous vision, in particular the sensor stimulation, adaptation and learning, memory and inference, goals and reinforcement. We know that these are ingredients to come up with a cognitive system, but we still don't know exactly the details of all this. But it turns out that the part that we know probably better is the sensory processing, because we can measure with high precision. We have instruments, human-centric instruments that can measure it with high precision the environment, and we know that it's amazing. The eye of the fly is sensitive to a single photon. The olfaction in dogs, they can find an odor with 1 part per trillion, and the eardrum senses 2 to 10 minus 10 atmosphere. So this is really exquisite sensing. But of course, the problem of sensing, so we can say that sensory cortices can translate as much information from the world as there is in the world. But the problem is, how are we going to make sense of all this complex information? So this really, I think, is the important aspect, that if we look at biology, we see that, generally speaking, that what you have to have systems that have internal goals, right? And the internal goals is really the trigger for all the processing that goes on in the brain. But if you think about the brain as an internal representation system, of course, then we have sensory stimulus that come from the outside, so the brain sees the world through the senses. And we also have predictive models in the brain, and it turns out that the system then predicts what is going to happen in the world, and then the brain can use the body to really to verify if the action, for instance, is completed properly. And so this is a kind of a cycle, and it's called the perception action reward cycle. And I think it's really at the core of how we go from percepts, to decision making. Of course, we are still very far away from understanding all the pieces, but this is probably how it is going to be, we are going to put it together in model. So let me now go to the visual system. That is one of the systems that is heavily studied. And as you can see, this is a diagram from Van Nassen, where you see that the retina, so the light comes, from the world of the retina. You have U1, and then you have this interconnect, this distributed, hierarchical, almost fully connected circuitry that processes the visual information, and then this information is sent to the entorhinal cortex, and then end up in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where we believe that memories are consolidated. So from a system perspective, you see that the sensory cortex is nothing but a processor that gets information from the world and sends it to the hippocampus, for further storage or working memory conditions. And so this is basically what I tried in my lab to replicate. This is a very complex system, and so of course we have to do quite a bit of simplifications, but we try to keep the fundamental aspects of the architecture in the computational architecture, because here you see a set of modules. All of them are the same. Of course, I'm interested in video processing, so each one of these modules are built of dynamical systems that have memory and states, in states. And another thing that I would try to preserve is exactly that this bidirectional communication. So normally we think of systems like bottom up. You have data and we process the data. But it turns out that if you are interested in top-down control of this front-end system, you should think that there are top-down paths that I will be calling causes in this talk that integrate and modify the perception of the bottom-up architecture. And so this if you are interested, this has been published in the Proceedings of the IEEE a couple of years ago. And so the goal is to design such a system in an unsupervised manner. So I'm not interested in doing in using labels, because I think labels simplify the problem, but who gives you the labels for autonomous vision? That is the fundamental question. And so we have really to think differently. And so this is going to be a self-organizing system. We are interested in bringing time into the picture, so not only space as an image, but is the video with space-time. And we are going to use approximate Bayesian inference to train the parameters and to learn the architectures. So basically, the methodology that we are going to use is called predictive coding. And in predictive coding, the model attempts to reconstruct the input. So that means that you have a system that is fed with some input. The role of the system is exactly to try to predict what is input. So this is what is called predictive coding. The first works on predictive coding are very well known, Strassens and Fields. Learn the sparse codes of natural images with the sparse L1 normal regularization. The work that inspired me was Rao and Ballard models with using common filters and the particle filters with Lee Mumford and Friston's work on the hierarchical dynamical models. Of course, in deep learning right now, you also have models that effectively can be trained to reproduce the input. This is the one example is the autoencoder, right? The autoencoder is a model that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. And the idea of the autoencoder is that it's a symmetric structure with a bottleneck layer. So the image is presented, or the video is presented at the input, and you have an encoding to the bottleneck layer, and then you have a decoding from the bottleneck layer to the output layer that mimics the input. Our approach, that I call deep predictive coding networks, DPCN, relies on state models, and we don't need to have the decoding step. So we just need an encoding step. So let's see how we are going to try to handle this model. It can be linear or non-linear. The equations I'm showing are linear equations, but we are using over-complete representation, so the end result is really non-linear in terms of the input space. And this figure kind of tells you what we are trying to do. So our observation from the real world is this Y. And what we would like to do is we would like, with two internal variables, U of t and X of t, the U are the causes, the X is the states, we would like to reconstruct Y of t with an error as small as possible. All right? So this is really the fundamental, this is each one of the building blocks in the architecture figure. We have a model like this. Let's read the equations. The equations are simple because they are linear equations. So you see, I'm going to try to represent y of t as a sum of two terms, the multiplication of a matrix of coefficients C with the states, and the matrix of coefficients D with U, with the causes. And this term is a noise term. I like to think of it as uncertainty, because if I move these two terms to the left of the equation, you see that y of t minus this, if the model is perfect, this noise is going to be 0. So that means that if I have an n of t, the uncertainty is 0. That means that I was able to capture in the matrix C and D and in the variables x and u exactly what is in the input, right? And if I write the same, so this is called the observation equation, and the state equation, state update equation, is given by the information from the past. So I have the system has memory, and has a memory of the last step, and multiplying the online value for xt of minus 1 with this matrix A, and adding it with a term that is matrix of B that multiplies the cause, then this subtracted to the current value that you measure from the state gives you a difference, the uncertainty that is VFT. So to train these models, you basically would like to minimize somehow these two terms, N of t and VFT, okay? And we are going to do that exactly using an empirical base as a prior. And the advantage of this structure is that you can naturally cascade it in several layers. Why? Because this is the first layer, right, that I just explained to you. But then I can put another layer on top where this variable u of t, the cause in the second layer, is going to try to explain exactly the cause that came from the first layer. All right? And so this is nice because I'm using exactly the same equations all over the structure, right? And this gives us a very nice way of cascading and distributing the performance. All right, so there are two important steps in this model. The first one is the inference of states. So I like to get the new value of the state variable, and I'm going to do that by creating an overcomplete state representation of the dynamics in the patch. So I'm going to divide my image in little patches. Each patch is going to be responsible to fit into a model, and the feature extraction is exactly the inference of the states. And the second step is the inference of the causes. So the causes, u of t, are going to extract invariance on the image across patches. So you see that x of t effectively is quantifying the change of the state over time, and u is going to quantify the relationship of neighboring patches, okay, in space. And of course, I would like to make x of t and u of t as different as possible, right? Because otherwise, these systems have so many parameters that if I'm not careful the way I'm going to train, doing this inference, very likely you are going to confuse the two. So how are we going to do this for the inference of states? Well, we are going to use the log likelihood function as an energy function that is going to be a function of the observations, the states, the matrix C and A, that is the observation model, okay? And as I stated, what I like to do is really minimize the uncertainty in the reconstruction of the current observation from the state, and I'm going to use an L2 norm for that. But since I am using an overcomplete representation, I have to impose some sparseness in the state vector, and what I do, I'm going to use an L1 norm for that. It turns out that since I have a recurrent system, we found out that we have to add an extra L1 normal regularization term on the error. The difference between x of t and minus a xt minus 1 also has to be sparse. And if we don't do this extra step, then the system will not provide a reasonable representation. But we did this through experience, but now we understand why. Regarding the inference of the causes, As I said, I'm interested in finding structure in the space of the image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look locally at neighborhoods of the current patch. And I'm going to do some pooling operation, either mean pooling or we prefer to do max pooling, because this also decreases the dimensionality of the models. I'm also going to use the log likelihood as an energy function. And in this case, the big problem is to make sure that x of t, the states, and the causes really look at different parts of the information in space-time. And in order to do that, what we did a product of a term that involves, the causes, and we make it positive by exponentiation, and we minimize exactly the log likelihood, and we still place a constraint on sparseness on the causes themselves. So it's nice that when I write all this, we can really come up with an interpretation of the free energy. So this system, effectively, with this Bayesian formulation, is exactly is extracting information from the free energy of the system. And we can show that, and I think it's a nice relationship. So what is this doing? We can use statistical mechanics to effectively understand what the training is doing. All right. So, of course, I told you about how to infer the states and the causes. There are signals that change during the training. But I also have to tell you how I'm going to train the parameters of the model, the matrices that I showed you before. And for that, we use what is called dual estimation in the control literature, but it's very similar to really EM, expectation maximization. What we basically do, we first fix the states and learn the parameters. And the next step, we fix the parameters and we learn the new version of the states and we iterate. Okay, so this is greedy, and we are going to end up with some optimum on the neighborhood of but it's in a convex neighborhood. And we are using basically gradient descent to effectively learn the parameters of the model. Okay, and we do a normalization by the columns of C and D just to make sure that they are not trivial solutions. All right. So how does this work? Okay, I told you all this, and now let's see how this works in real imagery. We used the video database by Van Houten. That is really videos of natural scenes, and we use 17 by 17 patches. The state model is a dimension of 400. The cause, we have 100 dimensions for the causes. We are doing pooling 2 by 2. This is the first layer, just one layer, and we can see if I plot the columns of the matrix C that relates the observations with the states. You see these receptive fields that look very similar to exactly measurements that you could find in the V1. And so basically what this system does is the first step is kind of strange because you have this correlated imagery in the input space, and the first layer breaks it apart. Okay? In local features that I believe that we should not call them features, I prefer to call them basis functions for a representation space. That means that the rest of the system, what it's going to do is, the rest of the system is going to put together these little pieces that you find in the first layer. And to illustrate that, the layer 1 causes, remember the causes are already extracting information from the states in the observation model. The causes are starting to put together these little, the receptive fields in more complex receptive fields. Okay. So this is very interesting. And if I look now, since this is a space-time model, if I look at how the feature changed over time, I also find that they change very slowly. So for instance, assume that at time t, these receptive fields are activated. If I look at t+1, these same receptive fields, are still activated in slightly different positions with slightly different variations depending upon the input video. And in order to find out exactly how smooth this is, I'm plotting the states at time t versus the states at t+1, and you can see that most of the states really are aligned along the diagonal. So that means that you have very small fluctuations of these activations also over time. And this is done because the imagery is slowly changing. You see, so the model is able to capture this redundancy of the changing that is visible in normal world. Of course, since I'm a signal processing, expert, if you want to call it that way, I like to see how good this is, right? Because you get all these features, they are learned directly from data. How do you know if they are good or bad, right? So what we decided to do, we did a model of each one of those receptive fields with a Gabor function. Okay, if you know Gabor functions, it's an extension of a Gaussian with a modulating term. And basically, in the receptive field of 15 by 15, we plotted all the different models of the Gabor, and you can see that they are uniformly structured over the receptive field. So the model was able to capture from this scene, really a basis set that really covers the space, and covers the space in the location, and covers the space also in angle. That means that you have all the possible orientations. And after that, obviously, then we realized that we don't really need to train again these parameters, because they fill the space. Okay? So this is very interesting, because this gives us immediately the ability to really do transfer learning, if you will. Okay, so we also were interested in what type of invariances the causes take from the states, and we found out that they normally, what they do translation invariant representations. Okay, and so because you can see here, these figures are very nice. I told my student that if he was not graduating, he could sell this as pop art on the web, because they have very appealing images. But he did graduate. Anyway, but you see that really, so we play. But this is analysis of the model. You see, this is something that I encourage all of you to do in your own neural network, training. Just see what the model learned. Don't look only at the result. This really gives us confidence that the system is really doing what we think it should be doing. All right. So, but now I told you each one of the building blocks, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we cascade this in the architecture. As I told you, the program is exactly the same. So at the first layer, you patch the imagery. You have a state model for each one of these patches, and then the pooling on the U of D. If you do max pooling, you are going to reduce the dimensionality of the model, because you are going to get the invariances from these neighborhood patches, and then you can do this exactly one extra layer. So this is greedy training. So you train this model one layer at a time. And I still would like to tell you that this is a bidirectional architecture, right? So if I tell you that it's a bidirectional architecture, I have to tell you how you can change the inference if a signal exists from the top, okay? And likewise, we extend the energy function with an extra term that basically is still a generative model. So I'm trying to represent as much as I can the information that comes from the top, using basically this L2 minimization. Okay, so this kind of completes how I can use this. All right, so this model works very well for small images, but does not scale up well for large images. Okay, so how can we do that? Okay, so we know in machine learning very well how we go from pixels to larger images. We use convolution networks, right? And so that's, again, that's exactly the aspect, the method that we utilize. We changed the